The new development bank, founded by BRICS, has become an important multilateral framework for financing infrastructure and sustainable development projects in the BRICS countries, as well as other emerging economies and developing nations. As the influence of emerging economies on both the global economy and the new world order increases, and the global economy faces downward pressures, how will the NDB define its role in the development and prosperity of BRICS and other nations? How will institutions such as BRICS help to boost economic transformation? And what can the emerging NDB add to the current global financial landscape? To discuss the many issues related to the NDB and more, I'm very happy to be joined here by Leslie Maasdorp, Vice President and Chief Financial Officer of the New Development Bank at the Boao Forum for Asia. That's our topic. This is a dialogue. I'm Yang Rui. Welcome to our discussion here, Leslie. Participants, the Chinese foreigner-like who converge here in Boao, the Chinese equivalent of what is called the World Economic Forum of Davos, show their unanimous, consistent, and single focus on economic performance, of course, and particularly the second biggest economy, Chinese economy. So what do you think of the general picture? Are you optimistic, cautiously optimistic, or the other way around in the year 2019, when the Chinese economy is expected to slow down to between 6 and 6.5% in terms of GDP growth?
Firstly, thanks for having me on the show, Ray. As you know, both the World Bank and the IMF, two of the most international, sort of respected international agencies, have already downgraded their growth forecast for 2019. And we know from the pronouncements of the Chinese policymakers that the Chinese economy is clearly also slowing down. But slowing down within a context of still significant growth. China is projected to grow around between 6 and 6.5% in 2019. But in general, it's very clear that there are considerable uncertainties, considerable new vulnerabilities and risks that will impact on the environment in 2019. So we are entering a challenging period. It's against the backdrop, as you know, of a rising mood of protectionism, rising sort of unilateralism, greater focus on inward-looking policies. In response to this environment, though, fortunately, I think, Chinese policymakers have in fact focused on greater opening up, because as you know, China has just emerged from, or China is just celebrating the 40 years of reform and opening up. I just returned from the China Development Forum in Beijing, where the theme was greater opening up. So in response to this protectionist impulse, if you like, or direction towards more unilateral and inward-looking policies, China is in fact saying we will open up more. And that is the important aspect of the next phase of China's growth.
And therefore, Leslie, the follow-up question is, on the one hand, China has been the powerhouse of the world economy of up to 30% for a number of years. Do you think this momentum is likely to continue despite all the adversity of the protectionism, unilateralism, or the general trend of deglobalization to a large degree?
Look, there's no question that China will continue to be a major contributor to global growth. You know, the core growth engines of the Chinese economy, consumption, investment, global trade, will continue to drive economic growth. However, what is important to look at now is what are the structural changes that are taking place in the Chinese economy that hopefully will propel it forward for a much longer period into the future. I would say, broadly speaking, if you look at the last 30, 40 years of reform and opening up, the focus has been on economic expansion, rapid economic growth. Now it's much more about the quality of that growth. Because as you know, Ray, you can have significant economic growth, but it can deepen inequality, as you've seen in many parts of the world. You can have rapid growth, but you can have destruction of the environment, as we've seen from environmental damage that has been done here in China. You can have rapid economic growth, but the profits could be leaving the country in the form of dividends to companies, let's say, that are foreign owned. So one cannot just look at globalization as a one-way street. What you're seeing now in China, I think, is much more focused on how we can have sustainable economic expansion that is much more inclusive and is much more green. And that's one of the things that we as a bank, and we can talk about, is very committed to, how we can help and enable greater environmental sustainability through the provision of infrastructure.
Asia used to rely on labor-intensive industries, environmentally unfriendly. Today, we talk more and more about the use of digital technology to show up the performance of most of the economies, either in ASEAN or for Northeast Asia, ROK, Japan, or China. What do you think of the driving force of digital technology in sustaining the momentum and dynamics of the regional economy here in Asia?
As you will see from the program here at WOW over the next few days, there's a significant focus on what the future of the digital economy will entail, and how this will be a further impetus and further source of dynamism in the growth path. There's no question that Asia is playing a leading role in the world economy in that regard. If you just look at the giants that have emerged in e-commerce, the giants of the internet economy and so on. But I think it's very important to emphasize that the world is intertwined and interdependent and interconnected. Therefore, the idea that China can grow or Asia can grow at the expense of the West or Europe or the rest of the world is a fallacy. The world is far too intertwined. Supply chains are too interconnected. Let's take our iPhones. iPhone might be manufactured here, but there's more than a dozen countries that are involved in the production of that phone, and intellectual property comes from even more countries. So one must look at it more as in terms of that intertwined interconnectedness of the rest of the world.
Leslie, I was suggesting very strongly that it is absolutely a fallacy for the Trump administration to decouple the Chinese economy in the age of a global chain and globalization.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Right. Let's come back to examine the functions and strategy of New Development Bank. You're going to have the next round of enlargement for the future of NDB. Do you think the United States will be listed as one of the developed countries who will apply for a membership or a seat in New Development Bank? If that's the case, what do you think their attitudes towards the growing use of RMB or other major currencies such as the euro, Japanese yen, and the British sterlings?
Firstly, Ray, when the bank was set up, it was always the ambition of the forefathers of the bank, the founding fathers, to create a global institution. In the first phase, it was going to be a BRICS institution. After that, the bank is going to expand and allow in further more emerging markets as well as developed countries. So in the next phase of the bank, the BRICS countries will dilute. They each own 20% each now, and they will dilute to 11%. So that's 55% between the 5 countries. A further 25% of the shareholding will be set aside for other developing countries or emerging markets, and the final 20% will be for the developed industrialized world. That process has not started yet, and we will be guided by our Board of Governors, the Ministers of Finance, on the pace of that opening up. However, it is very important to recognize that the bank is not positioning itself in competition with other multilateral institutions. In our legal articles of agreement when we were set up, the word complementarity is used very explicitly. So what that means is that we do our activities by lending for infrastructure finance in partnership with and working in a complementary fashion with other institutions. But your question around the US dollar is a very important one, and for example the renminbi. The renminbi, as you know, was included in the IMF basket of special drawing rights. So the RMB is already part of the 5 global currencies, and whilst it is still small, the direction, the trajectory is that the RMB will become a much more important global currency over time. But the US dollar for a long time will remain the anchor currency because of its sheer size. It has been the reserve currency for 75 years now, since 1944, and because of the volume of transactions in US dollars, it will take a very long time for the US dollar to lose that status, if you like.
Well, despite the allegation that US dollar has actually lost its original value since it was separated from the gold standard in the early 1970s. That means somehow the disintegration of the Bretton Woods system. Now, let us know briefly your comments on the credit rating of NDB. It's said to be different from those somehow from the Standard & Poor, Moody. Tell us more, please.
Yeah. So the 5 BRICS countries, as you know, since we were established in 2015, have experienced almost a synchronized downturn. So the economic fortunes, the economic performance of Brazil, of South Africa, of Russia, of China, each of our countries went downward since we arrived here in Shanghai. So the average credit rating of our sovereigns, of our governments now is BBB-, which is at investment grade, if you like. The bank achieved last year, which is probably one of the highest achievements of the bank so far, a AA+ international credit rating. Now that is just one level below the highest credit rating possible, which is AAA. There are very few institutions in the world that have AAA rating. We are just one level below that. So what S&P and Fitch have indicated with that credit rating is saying that this bank has the highest credit quality. And may I add, in the emerging markets, we are the highest rated financial institution, because there are no AA+ internationally rated institutions in China or Brazil or Russia or India or any of the other emerging markets. Why is this important? It's significant because it allows us to raise funding cheaper than what we otherwise would have, and we are therefore then able to on-lend to our countries at much more preferential rates. So the price of the loans that we are giving to China, to Brazil, to Russia, to India, etc., is much lower because we have such high credit quality.
Thank you so much, Leslie. You are watching Dialogue here in Hainan, and Leslie Maasdorp is the guest speaker here. He is Vice President and Chief Financial Officer of the New Developed Bank. In fact, it's a banking institution of emerging markets, particularly BRICS. We'll be back in a short while. Stay with us.
Digital Asia. Asia is in the forefront of digitization. But can the digital revolution bring new growth patterns to the world? We will wait and see.
Ideas alter perspectives. Ideas bring change. Ideas become motives for new actions. Ideas have different faces. Ideas surpass all expectations. Ideas matter. You are invited to watch my show from Monday through Sunday on CGTN.
Welcome back, Leslie. Very interesting issue about your investment in green projects. Tell us some of the projects you have invested in, and what do you think of the prospects for the return of the investment?
Yeah. So firstly, when the bank started, when the bank was launched, at our first meeting, each of the heads of state, in fact I think it was Prime Minister Modi from India at the time, but endorsed by all the other member country presidents, indicated that they want the bank to have a very strong focus on green energy and sustainability. So our first 5 projects that we announced in mid-April 2016 were all in the energy space, and they were all green. So why is this significant? It's important because if you just look at the energy system in China, there's a major coal-fired energy grid system. Similarly in India,
70 to 80% of the general power generation comes from coal burning.
That's exactly
that causes
right.
a lot of
in South Africa, it's even higher.
Earth.
It's closer to 90% in South Africa. In India, it's high. In Brazil, it's high, and so on. Each of these countries made certain undertakings and commitments in Paris Accord to over time reduce their carbon emissions. And there's now significant programs to build renewable energy, not just solar, wind, hydro in all of our countries. So what the bank is doing now is laying the basis and helping our 5 member countries to accelerate that process to build a bigger green energy system. Now, a lot of innovation is coming out of the green movement. In other words, one shouldn't just see it as shifting technologies moving away from coal to green. Green energy now is a source of new innovation. And for example, let's just take the electric car, electric vehicles in China. China is the biggest market in electric vehicles right now. But battery storage, all of the technology breakthroughs that are happening in energy will be a source for future growth in other sectors of the economy. But just to give you an example, we are in each of our 5 member countries working with the existing energy grid systems to try and do environmental cleanup. So let's take South Africa, where I am from. In South Africa, we have a loan to Eskom to connect, to build and extend the transmission network to connect the independent power producers, the green solar power producers, to the national grid. So that is a concrete way how we are helping the independent energy producers connect their power to the national grid system. We're doing similar projects in all of the 5 member countries.
We marvel at the equal contributions, financial contributions by each of the 5 member states of New Development Bank. Let's look at the other member states from South Africa, India, to Russia and Brazil. What do you think of the general performance of South Africa under the new leadership of President Ramaphosa? He is accused of being increasingly self-interested and perhaps the land redisposal will cause more debates in the parliament.
Let me put it this way. I think it's very important to look at economic growth and performance through a little bit more longer-term lenses, right? One cannot really look at economic performance through single years. I mean, as you know, South Africa grew in the early 2000s up until the financial crisis at very rapid rates of around 5% on average. The financial crisis was a significant turning point in South Africa. In 2009, the country went through a recession. For the first time in a long period, the country went into recession. And since then, has pretty much struggled to get back onto a sustainable growth path. It's kind of hovered around 1.5% or so over the last 9 years, 1.5%. Now, Cyril Ramaphosa has been in office for just over a year. And it's too early to judge, Ray, to make a considered opinion on what has been the impact of his policies. One needs to have a little bit of a longer trajectory. But the initiatives that he has put in place since he has come into office are very encouraging. Number one, he has gone on to a major campaign to improve the governance of state-owned enterprises. State-owned enterprises play a major role in the South African economy. Let's take energy. Eskom is the leading provider of electricity. Let's take transport. Transnet is the leading provider of rail, pipeline, road infrastructure. In each of these state-owned enterprises, he has moved swiftly to deal with allegations of corruption. He has changed the boards of Eskom, of Transnet, and a number of other enterprises. So the direction of change is positive, but it is too early to assess whether these initiatives that have been put in place will lead to a sustainable growth path and a reversal of what has been subpar performance in South Africa.
Many policy options had been reversed by the Nelson Mandela administration since the end of apartheid in 1995. The issue that most of the Chinese observers show great interest in, I'm afraid, at this moment, is why South Africa deserves credit for being so bold and liberal in shaping its new economic, market-oriented economy, such as liberalization of the monetary policies and the exchange regime, great ups and downs in the exchange regime, and that let us hold our breath for quite a while in observing why South Africa went so far. With China still being so cautious about the capital market, we are not yet determined as to whether and when we can fully and completely open up the capital market. So what can we learn from South Africa, or what are the lessons we should avoid in navigating our own course of financial development in the near future?
So, of course, Africa and China, as you know, Ray, are very different countries with very different histories in so many respects. But let me start with China. In the last 40 years of reform and opening up, as you know, China globalized its economy. It became the manufacturing hub of the world, producing for the world economy. But during that time, the financial markets and capital markets were substantially closed, as you know. If you look at the Chinese banking sector, Chinese insurance sector, asset management sector, it is largely domestic, right? The banks dominating China, literally just 5 big mega institutions, and then you've got a range of second-tier banks. What China's committed itself to do now, and in fact, you might recall last year when we were here, President Xi Jinping was here last year, and he announced that China will begin a process of opening up its financial sector. That was formalized most recently. There was a foreign investment law passed by the People's Congress.
That's a major piece of legislative landmark document.
Major piece of legislation, because what it does, it levels the playing fields for foreign firms. So what you're going to see now is competition in the banking sector here in China. There will no longer be limits on the ownership of foreign firms in the domestic market. This, I believe, is going to lead to significant new opportunities, a much more efficient financial and capital markets, because you'll have more market-based capital allocation, if you like. So the next phase of China's growth is, for example, also going to lead to significant inflows into the bond market. The bond market in China is the third largest in the world. However, it is 98% owned by domestic institutions, only 2% foreign. With the opening up the new regulatory measures that have been announced, there is potentially going to be new inflows into the Chinese bond market going forward.
Leslie, I'm afraid some of the Chinese might be a little bit cautious as to whether this could be regarded as a shock therapy in terms of raising the shares of foreign participation in our financial services. So let's look at India. The BJP is facing a major election, and Prime Minister Modi faces challenges from the opposition party about this domestic reforms, such as monetary policies, taxation, so on and so forth, to hopefully ease tensions within the caste system, to level the playing field for all major players in this major economy. What do you think of, say, the hurdles and the challenges that Prime Minister Modi faces at the moment?
I think in each of our countries, you used the word shock therapy early on. I just wanted to clarify that the policies that I was referring to here in China and in our other countries as well are all focused on gradual, incremental change. In China, there's not going to be an overnight, flow of foreign banks and asset
managers. Because we are still awash with the bitter memories about setbacks that the Russian Federation went through in the early days of its ending the Cold War and saying goodbye to the former Soviet Empire.
Absolutely. The jury is out about the value of shock therapy of that kind of big bang approaches, if you like. There is much more value in a systematic, incremental and gradual change. You mentioned, let me just talk about South Africa, and before I come to India. In South Africa, we have always had a much more open economy. We've had capital controls, and we still have some capital controls, but we have a much more open economy, which means that our exchange rate, for example, is significantly more volatile, right? So since I've been here, the Chinese renminbi, the Chinese yuan has kind of fluctuated. I've arrived here in 2015 between 6.6, 6.7 to the US dollar to about 6.8, 6.9, and it stayed within that band. Whereas the South African rand is much more volatile within a much bigger range. So the volatility that you referred to in South Africa earlier on is a function of the fact that it's a much more open economy. It's a small open economy, and the rand is much more of a traded currency internationally. So we are much more subjected to volatilities in the markets. There's a lot of inflows into the South African market, and if there is a bit of a crisis in some other emerging market, there's a flight to safety, as they call it, and then you find short-term money, portfolio flows in the equity and bond markets moving out. So that is one of the adverse consequences of having a much more of an open economy. Coming back to India. India is obviously the star performer in the global economy today, but it does also have structural issues that it is confronting with. And during an election campaign, as they are going through now, they have an election in a matter of weeks, these issues come to the surface and so on. But again, in India, one can also see, other than the demonetization which took place recently, which was introduced a little bit as a surprise to many, India's policy has also been very much focused on much more gradual implementation of more market-based reforms.
Very quickly about Brazil, where we have a very ambitious president newly elected, and he's said to be the Donald Trump of Brazil. What do you make of his economic policies?
Again, as I said with President Ramaphosa earlier on, it is very difficult to assess the economic performance in Brazil under the current leadership, because the new president has been in power literally for 4 months, right? But the important point is that since Brazil went into the economic recession, Brazilian economy contracted, I think it was -3% actually 2 years ago, and it's going back into growth. It is projected to grow by the end of this year. So the key point is that there has been structural changes in the economy. The government has been focused on ensuring that it can lay the foundations for growth going forward. Christine Lagarde, the head of the International Monetary Fund, have this expression that you need to fix the roof of the house when it's not raining. So what that effectively means is that you have the best time to sort of deal with the underlying deeper structural issues in the economy when you're going through tougher times. So in the case of Brazil, I think a lot of the underlying reforms that are required to bring the economy back into growth territory are being implemented. So we feel very positive about the economic pronouncements of the current government.
But the newly elected President Bolsonaro talked tough about China during the campaign, on the campaign trail. President Putin assumes the 4th term, and his office term will last till 2024. So what do you think of the Russian economic performance in the age of, say, economic sanctions since Crimea?
Over the last couple of years, the Russian economy has experienced some volatility in its performance, but it has always also shown upward trajectories. Just most recently, for example, Moody's, the credit rating agency, upgraded the sovereign rating. Obviously, Russia is much more of a commodity-based economy, so what happens to the prices of oil and gas has a major impact on that economy. There has been external factors that have also impacted on the economic performance, but in general, if you look at the macroeconomic indicators, they all look very positive. So we are very confident that in each of our BRICS countries, the policymakers have put down the important levers that will contribute to sustained growth going forward.
Thank you so much. That's our dialogue with Leslie Maasdorp, Vice President and Chief Financial Officer of New Development Bank, a financial institution of BRICS economies. Thank you for being with us, and that's the first edition of our dialogue here in Boao Forum for Asia in Hainan. See you next time. Until then, goodbye.